When we take into account what happened in last week's gospel, today's gospel scene is pretty intense. I mean, what a difference. Last week in our gospel, we were left on a high note, particularly St. Peter, and how he proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah. And Jesus says to him, "It's on you, the rock on which I'm going to build my church. Not even the gates of the netherworld can hold it back." And then Peter today, it's like things have kind of just turned completely around. This moment of glory just becomes a moment of real sadness. The man that Jesus praised as the rock upon which he's going to build his church is now becoming more like a stumbling stone on Jesus' path to fulfilling the Father's will. Jesus criticizes Peter, and he criticizes him for being an obstacle. And then he tells him that he's not thinking straight. So what's going on? Well, I think it's kind of like Henry. So a young man, he wanted to be a star journalist, but he lived in a small town. So one day, the dam upstream broke and the town was flooded. He got into a rowboat and he headed out to look for a story. Well, he found this lady sitting on her rooftop. He tied up the boat, went up, and he told her what he was after, that he was looking for a story for the local paper. They both watched there on the roof as various objects floated by. She would say to him, "Oh, look, now, there's a story, there's a story." And he would respond, "No, that's not a story." Well, finally, they see a hat float by. Then it goes a little way down the street, does an 180-degree turn, and comes back the opposite direction. And this happens a few times, this hat back and forth just above the water. The young man says, "Now, there's a story." "Oh, no, that's not a story," said the woman. "That's my husband, Henry. He said he's going to mow the lawn come hell or high water." I mean, talk about stubbornness, right? Peter in today's scene is kind of like Henry, and I think we often are in our lives. We're way in over our heads. But he's adamant that it's his way or the highway, come hell or high water. Peter knows best. Peter's obstinate. And in his obstinacy, he hears only the themes of defeat and suffering. He can't see past the fact that his best friend is saying that he has to suffer and that he's going to die. He can't see past that. He can't see any value in that. There's no redemption in suffering. That he will rise on the third day? No way. I can't even get past the fact that he suffers. You see, while Jesus has his mind set on the glory that will be, that's going to be ushered in with his death and resurrection, all Peter can focus on is the suffering and death. He's got no time for the glory that's to come. In the span of a few lines, Peter goes from rock-solid optimism to wobbly pessimism. His worldview shrinks into an island of self-importance and self-preservation. He literally just proclaimed who Jesus was, but he can't reconcile that with this impending suffering and death. Now, here's how Peter stands in God's way. He becomes this obstacle. He makes far too many assumptions about God's will. He limits God to our limitations. He mistakes his own values for God's values, which is one of humanity's favorite maneuvers. Peter doesn't like to suffer, and so he can't imagine that God might make sense or make use of that suffering for his divine ends. Most of all, Peter interprets the proposed death of Jesus as a road to nowhere. What good can come from your death, Lord? Therefore, I'm not even going to entertain it. Jesus is so critical of Peter, he gives him a name, and he points out his his way of seeing the world, this attitude that's inconsistent with what he's trying to inculcate in his disciples. And he calls him Satan, which is a Jewish word, by the way, made to represent great adversary. It's a name that means exactly to oppose or to obstruct. So Satan is the stumbling block on the path, the adversary, the obstacle. And he says to him, "Get behind me, Satan. Don't stand in front of me with your obstacles, but get behind me so I can move in the direction my Father has asked me to go." Friends, when we pin our hopes on earthly kingdoms instead of the lasting one and impose our will over God's will, we're standing on the threshold of an ancient evil, and we would be better to get out of the way. Friends, aren't we too often like Peter? Don't we struggle with the back and forth of living out our faith, oftentimes becoming our own worst enemy? Don't we often think that we know better than God, and he should start listening to us? But more times than not, like Peter, we have the hardest time in our faith, in the life of faith, when we're the ones who try to control. We want to contain God. We want to derail the divine energy of God and manipulate it to give us what we want. And in our limitation, we foolishly think that we can do better, that we can do things more efficiently than God. Just give me the tools, God, and I'll take care of it. In our limitations, we realize we don't have what it takes. And in our efforts to blaze our own trail towards happiness, we look to God and we tell him to follow us. Just get out of the way. At best, we may be able to see a half step in front of us. But more times than not, the direction that we take is one that takes us back rather than moving in the direction that's best for us. But we fall into this cycle constantly. Our stubbornness and our unwillingness to get on board with Jesus' plan, it makes us an obstacle to God, not only for ourselves, but for others. And it doesn't lead us to happiness, not in the way God intended. Remember some time ago, I heard someone say that if you go to heaven, you take 5 people with you. If you go to hell, you take 5 people with you. I really believe that, because we can become our own worst enemy. But it's not just us who are affected, it's those around us. Friends, God has a plan, but in order for that plan to flourish, we have to constantly get out of the way. And by out of the way, I don't mean that we become indifferent or that we recklessly throw our hands up in the air in abandonment. That's not what that means. We get out of the way by getting in line with God's will. We stop being obstacles when we ourselves become paths for God's will. By getting behind the Lord and following him, not always asking him to follow us. You know, at the end of our gospel passage, Jesus makes it abundantly clear to his disciples and to us that following him is gonna cost a lot. And you have to give everything. And there are no half measures on this journey. It just can't work that way because there's too much at stake. That's why he says you have to lose your life to find it. But what we find is so much more. You know, Henry, in our story, he had a choice. St. Peter has a choice, and so do we. We could swim or drown. We could follow the map maker or be our own blind guide. Friends, our reading this week reminds us to get behind the Lord, to follow him, or else we'll just be a stumbling block to ourselves and to others, all while holding on to our lawnmower as the floodwaters rush overhead.